Republic, the New York Review of Books, The Guardian, and has been an art and cultural critic for the New Yorker since 1994. Professor Schama's work has been translated. Professor Schama has also worked as a writer and presenter for the BBC. His award-winning 15-part History of Britain drew 4 million viewers in the UK and was shown in the US on the History Channel. So with no further ado.
Good, thanks. Oh, this is so nice. Forgive me the throat. I'm just sort of getting out of a horrible kind of flu-y condition, which I'll try not to give to you. I'm sitting as far back as I possibly can. But if any of you, during the middle of my remarks, suddenly get up and throw up, I won't take it personally. It's just you've contracted whatever it was I had. So this is fantastic. So it looks like, you know, the nicest college there ever was. So there will actually be an exam before you leave the room, okay? So I don't want to hear any kind of snoring or at least no audible snoring going on. So here's this funny book I wrote called Rough Crossings, and which I expect, since it was only published yesterday, not all of you will have read from cover to cover yet. It's quite a long book, although it was said by my editor, who's not here, 416 pages, Simon, a pamphlet for you, which is probably right, one of my shorter efforts. Why should anyone be interested in the story of the slaves who decided to vote with their feet for the British rather than American freedom? And I think the answer is, you know, summed up in one life, really. Henry Washington, sometimes known as Harry Washington, who was one of George Washington's slaves, who, as soon as he had the opportunity, voted with his feet and went to the British, and I'll explain why in a minute. You can go down the list of the Southern signers of the Declaration of Independence. James Madison, Arthur Middleton, Edward Rutledge, South Carolina signers of the Declaration of Independence, and another important founding father, Patrick Henry. A week, we think, after Patrick Henry stands up in the Virginia House of Burgesses and says, "Give me liberty or give me death," his slave, Rafe Henry, says, "Fine, I think I'll have liberty," and heads as fast as he can for the Union Jack. Why are they doing this? Because in the autumn of 1775, in November 1775, the last governor of Virginia, a man called the Earl of Donlore, by no means a kind of humanitarian abolitionist, but someone who was desperately short of soldiers, issues a proclamation approved by the government in London saying that any slave leaving a rebel plantation, in effect, who makes it to the King's lines and willing to serve in whatever capacity, some of them did in fact fight, but a much larger number of those who did take the offer seriously served as sappers, ditch diggers, carters, spies, sometimes very dangerous jobs. Anybody who serves the king for the duration of the present conflict will receive their freedom. And Donlore, in fact, got together almost overnight an army of a few hundred runaway slaves who were called the Ethiopian Regiment, and who were the first to go into battle for the king with a badge like this on their breast that said, "Liberty to slaves." That had not happened in America before. So this is a story of cynical motives that produced extraordinary inadvertent good and great heroism. There are a lot of, ultimately it's a tragic story, because if in fact for the blacks in the American South, their enemy's enemy was their friend, better the British than their American slave masters, however loudly people like Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry spoke about liberty, the reality of their world was anything but liberty. And there were many British, there were some British who betrayed their promises. There were British officers and British generals who kept their promises, and those who indeed serve out their time in the war and who made it to safety in British lines continued to be free, and in fact had documents in New York. They were called General Birch certificates. I'll come on to, in a second, actually, the extraordinary moment at the end of the war in 1783, where that freedom seemed frighteningly transitory for a moment or two. So what we have is essentially a kind of tragic odyssey that, again, I'm going to talk about without taking up too much time. And of course, it's a story that actually you will not find particularly in your standard social studies high school textbook, or am I wrong? You know, did you all know that the first women to vote for anything, anywhere in the world, were runaway slaves freed by the British who made it in the end all the way back to Africa as free blacks and voted in local government elections in Sierra Leone? Does it appear in social studies textbooks that the first articulate African-American political leaders essentially are those who fought in the British Army or were aligned with the British during the Revolutionary War and after? The first free black churches, the first free black schools, all a part of this extraordinary experience, this enormous exodus. We think, most historians working on this, that something like between 80 and 100,000 slaves left the plantations during the American Revolutionary War in an attempt to get to British lines. Did they all fight? The overwhelming number did not. Many died of smallpox. Many were captured by the American Patriot side. Some sort of ran between the two lines and were caught in between. But some did fight. There were black guerrilla partisans fighting in boats on the Hudson River, picking off Patriot settlements and Patriot supply posts. The first great black guerrilla captains, a man called Colonel Ty, ferocious, ruthless, heroic, implacable, worked out of New Jersey and not very far away again on the Hudson River. So where's this story gone? Well, everybody, it's a little bit of a party pooper on the 4th of July, isn't it? Frederick Douglass said, "What is your 4th of July to me?" It's a little inconvenient. Hence, actually, in Britain, where this book already came out, they said, "Great story, Simon." Actually, one of my friends, Alison Pearson, novelist, she said, "Fantastic story, Simon. I really look forward to visiting you in Gitmo, in Guantanamo." So I don't think an orange jumpsuit's not your look, really. Said, "How's your green card?" You know, just got my new green card, so that's okay. So, but of course, to digress a bit, and I'll come back to the story, which I hope you want to hear lots more about, and I'm happy to ask questions about. For me, the great strength and beauty and virtue of Western history, by which all I mean is history written since Herodotus and Thucydides, has been its unflinching, self-critical honesty. The Peloponnesian War, the first great knockout masterpiece of historical writing, is the history of what in Britain we call a cock-up, the expedition to Syracuse. How weird is it that all you usually get in American core curriculum from that book is Pericles' funeral speech? The reason it's good to die for democracy, a very important document. But the reason that document is very important is because it leads you to an absolutely chilling account written by a veteran general. Thucydides was himself a general, of how catastrophic imperial overreach was for the Athenians. So from the beginning, history has been a cautionary or tragic muse. It's not been in the thumb-sucking lullaby, feel-good consolatory. You know, there's kind of history into the mirror of which we look, and there's a slight temptation. I speak as someone who spent half my life in America and half my life in Britain. Because life is tough in America in 2006, it was tough in 2001. In 2006, I want to sort of find a generation, our founding fathers. We may be deeply screwed now. We may actually be bereft of half-decent, fully witted leadership. But once, by God, there was a leadership where Washington, Jefferson, Madison were wise, strong, virtuous, truthful, honest, powerful, and victorious. Well, yes, all of that is true. But how much deeper and richer and more powerful does that history become when we complicate it a bit with the stories that ought to be told alongside the feel-good message? This, I don't think, is, especially if you're African American, this is not a feel-bad story. It's a sort of think hard story, I suppose. God, that sounds so glib, and I just thought it up. But it is actually just makes you think a bit more about what you would have done. History is supposed to, it's above all a kind of an encounter with the other, with people who lived long before us. Auden described it as breaking bread with the dead. It's essentially another wonderful thing about history. It's wired, if you'll forgive the word, it's wired to be tolerant because actually you're encountering people who are not of your own time or of your own place. And in this case, those you encounter are plantation slaves who say, what am I going to do? You know, there's all this noise about liberty that my master is making. On the other hand, there is also this, the redcoats, are they all scoundrels? Are they all cynics? And part of the story of this book is that, amazingly, we know from runaway advertisements before the Revolutionary War starts, in other words, around 1773 and 1774, and early in 1775, runaway advertisements for the return of captured slaves that say Cato or Scipio or Pompey, gone to the British in the parenthesis, deluded, in effect, belief that, that they will receive freedom in Old England. What had happened was a series of court cases in the 1770s in Britain itself, in London, in which the Lord Chief Justice had been almost forced to rule that nobody could be transported against their will in England, that the status of a slave, in effect, you could still be a slave in England. He was a bit misunderstood in that respect. He was ruling. But essentially, you couldn't be resold to the West Indies. But the way those court cases got reported, and somehow they got back in gazettes and journals, made their way to Western America. And among the semi-literate or literate groups of slaves, some of them in the North, the news of Lord Mansfield's decisions, especially in a case called the James Somerset case, meant that there was some sense among the slave community in the South when the war started that somehow to be British might actually offer a better chance of becoming free than if you stayed American. And when I found a slave, about whom we know very, very little, but we know this one incredibly important fact, who decided to call himself British Freedom, which in the American Revolution sounds like an oxymoron, decided to call himself British Freedom, we know that mythical or not mythical, that belief that by actually getting somehow to British lines, you would earn your freedom, was extremely deeply rooted and provoked this extraordinary exodus of tens of thousands of people that I write about in the book. Another very interesting issue is that we know that before the Revolutionary War, most escapes and plantations were invariably adult males. From the documents we have of those 3,000 or so freed ex-slaves who end up here in New York at the end of the Revolutionary War, an extraordinary number of them actually were women who went in groups of women, sometimes with men who were the fathers of the children, sometimes not. Large numbers clearly ran away from North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, Maryland, in family groups, again, often with very, very small children, commandeering or stealing boats, trying to make it to the British ships, trying to make it behind British lines in Philadelphia and New York. And a few of them subsequently become preachers, so they leave memoirs of actually what happened to them. And I use those memoirs, that's all we have. But we do, for the first time, have real African-American voices to work with in describing the difficulties and the perils of this experience. Here's one of those voices describing what it's like to be in New York at the end of the war. This is a city which has its own free black encampment downtown, which was no picnic at all. And blacks, meanwhile, had served in, some of them had been abandoned disgracefully by Cornwallis. Some of the other British generals had been genuinely benevolent, like Sir Henry Clinton. They'd served in sieges. They'd served crucially in the siege of Savannah and the siege from the other way around of Charleston. One of them, who's really the first African-American political leader, sergeant in the British Army, called Tom Peters, in the British Pioneers, had been twice wounded, promoted, become one of these very tough veteran, as it were, except they didn't wear red coats, they wore blue coats, although I'd say black red coats. The man I'm just going to read a very quick paragraph from is called Boston King. He was a slave who was actually a slave in a racehorse breeding colony in Wilmington, North Carolina. And he escapes, he joins the army in '76 along with thousands of others, serves. And then he becomes a Methodist preacher. That's why we have his memoir. And he's at New York at the moment when the war is over. So their thought is, what the hell is going to happen to us? New York was full of slave catchers, all George Washington, of course, who's responsible for negotiating the details of the evacuation of the British Army, is being hounded by his own friends and his own class in Virginia to have Negroes returned. In fact, a very last-minute clause was inserted in the preliminary peace treaty that said there should be no carrying off by the British Army of property and Negroes. That was the sort of suddenly inserted Article 7 of the Treaty of Paris. So they don't know. Here's how Boston King writes about that moment. About this time, peace was restored between America and Great Britain, which diffused universal joy among all parties, except us, who had escaped slavery and taken refuge in the English army. For a report prevailed at New York that all the slaves, in number 2,000, were to be delivered up to their masters, although some of them had been 3 or 4 years among the English. This dreadful rumor filled us with inexpressible anguish and terror, especially when we saw our old masters coming from Virginia, North Carolina, and other parts, and seizing upon slaves in the streets of New York and other parts. Seizing the streets of New York, or even dragging them out of their beds. Many of the slaves had very cruel masters, so that the thought of returning home with them, the masters, embittered life to us. For some days we lost our appetite for food, and sleep departed from our eyes. The English had compassion on us in the day of our distress, and issued out a proclamation importing that all slaves should be free, quote, who had taken refuge in the British lines, and claimed the sanction and privileges of the proclamations respecting the security and protection of Negroes. In consequence of this, each of us received a certificate from the commanding officer at New York, that was Samuel Birch, which dispelled our fears and filled us with joy and gratitude. Imagine a printed piece of paper promising this. Some of the children who'd been born during the war had a little certificate that said, born free behind British lines. And however, particularly in the evacuations from Charleston and Savannah, scoundrelly and hypocritical many of the British were, and by God they were, lots got resold back to the West Indies. There was one redeeming, indisputably decent moral moment. It happened in May '83. Washington meets with this last commander-in-chief of the British Army, a man called Sir Guy Carleton. No hero, but a basically doltish good egg. And they have a summit conference down at Tappan-on-Hudson. And Washington says, it's quite clear what the first piece of business was going to be, and said, we'll have our Negroes back. And Sir Guy Carleton said, well, my dear General, I wish I could oblige you, but they actually happen to all to be free, in effect, and are coming with us, and to Nova Scotia. And what's more, some of them have already left. And I'm sure, my dear General, I'm paraphrasing, I'm sure, my dear, you would not wish me to violate the word given by the King and his government in respect of reciprocity shown for services made during the war. And Washington was furious about this, felt particularly since ships had already started going. He apparently didn't know that on those ships he thought they were all slaves that belonged to loyalists. I should say that actually, if you were a loyalist slave, tough luck. You know, the deal only went, I mean, there was a huge degree of cynicism on the part of the British, but at this moment, you know, Carleton could utterly have folded. He did not fold. He said, they're coming with us. In effect, want to start the war over again? Start the war. There were still a lot of British troops around. War was not started. So, you know, 3,000 do sail off with the British to Nova Scotia, where Their freedom is honored, but that is about it. They were all supposed to get land, 25 acres to 100 acres. They don't get what they're promised. They go through incredible, desperate ordeals of misery and penury and privation. But they sort of stay together as a community, and they do stay free. They're reduced to indentured service, but they are educated enough to take to the courts sometimes when they suspect that their legal position is being depressed to that of being slaves. And again, the man I mentioned, Thomas Peters, is incensed enough and articulate enough and determined enough and militant enough to make it all the way back to London, not quite sure how, worked his passage, where he finds the ear of the black community, free black community in London, small but important group, and then the abolitionist movement in London, about whom a lot of the book is also about. Reports that the king's wishes, the government's wishes, are not being observed. They then send Peters back, along with a young 27-year-old naval lieutenant called John Clarkson, to make the following offer, that if you wish to stay in Nova Scotia, we will see to it that the promises in respect of land will now be observed. It was the white loyalists who were making life miserable for the black loyalists. If you do not, then we will make arrangements for you. We will actually pay for and assemble a fleet to take you to your own self-governing settlement, which would be Sierra Leone, which had an embryonic beginning 4 years earlier, but had been wiped out in an African raid in 1790. And something like 1,300 of them accept the offer to go to Africa. And there, the last part of the story is the story of this extraordinary, short-lived, they again run into all sorts of terrible trouble. They arrive in the rainy season. Their immune system isn't prepared for African diseases. They have an incredibly difficult time with the white councillors, the imperial councillors who are sent out from London. But they hang on, and for the first time, a free African-American community is self-governing. It has its own juries. It has its own political councillors. They're called tithing men and hundred doors. They have their own little military police force. When there's an extraordinary scene, for example, when a white sailor who's accused of persecuting and abusing some of these free blacks is tried for it and is flogged almost to death by a black constable called Simon Proof. And everybody is called in the entire settlement out to see this, whites and blacks together, for a free black administering the kind of flogging which they would only have remembered being administered to themselves as slaves. And some of those slaves completed this extraordinary arc of a journey, a small number, but very moving number of them, remembered, of course, having been taken in captivity as children, being sold to slavery in America, leaving the plantations during the Revolutionary War, making it to the British Army, staying with the British Army, going north to Nova Scotia, enduring hell there, and back across the Atlantic in this 15-ship fleet led by Clarkson. Clarkson himself is an extraordinary figure who leaves an 800-page diary journal, which is one of the great documents of 18th century romantic evangelical passion in English, and really there's a good online edition if you want to find it. But there really ought to be a proper print published edition. I might have a crack at it myself. Clarkson is someone who had been a naval officer, had served in the Caribbean, had shown not the slightest inkling of indignation about slavery. But his big brother becomes one of the great abolitionists in Britain, and he undergoes a kind of Pauline conversion. And he becomes, for about 2 years, it's his moment in the intense floodlight of history. He becomes a new person. He constantly investigates his own worthiness for the role. But he has this extraordinary sense, has a rather conflicted relationship with Thomas Peters, but he has this extraordinary sense that he is, as the blacks call him, their Moses, the one who's supposed to lead them to the promised land. So when he gets this fleet of 15 ships together to make this extraordinary crossing into freedom from Halifax, Nova Scotia to Sierra Leone, he's very conscious that some of them will have last encountered the Atlantic as slaves. So he travels on a hospital ship He makes absolutely certain that the amount of rations are very clearly specified, that the medical provisions for anyone falling sick, ditto, ditto. And they run into the most incredible, extraordinary, almost epic catastrophes, literally where the perfect storm happened in the movie off George's Bank, 2 storms rather than 3. And Clarkson actually rowing himself around the fleet the night before they all left from Halifax, giving everybody their own little certificate of land for Sierra Leone, she insisted on doing, caught something horrible. I think it might have been meningitis. He falls sick, badly sick, on the hospital ship, on the Lucretia, and doesn't move for 48 hours. His friend, Charles Taylor, the physician, thinks he's dead. They stitch him up in the canvas. He's just about to be committed to the deep, and he moves. Can't make this stuff up. We know about this because actually the doctor and the captain then reconstruct, he obviously isn't keeping his journal up, reconstruct it, and he transcribes it later from what they told him and from their own version of the log. The captain, of course, has to be called Captain Jonathan Coffin, doesn't he? And so they know he's still alive, and they take him down to his cabin, they kind of warm him up again, and he's sort of still out but alive. And almost at that moment, there's this gigantic kind of, not quite tsunami, huge storm smashes in the whole back of the ship, the deadlights, just where John Clarkson is. The captain runs down to find John Clarkson, he said, covered with blood and water. Amazingly, he's not washed out into the open ocean, but he's still very sick. He survives again. He's nursed again. Captain Coffin keeps a kind of vigil when he can by the bedside, and he contracts whatever it was that Clarkson had, and he does die. I told you all the good bits in a moment. And so Clarkson, when he gets better, has to actually bury the captain. So there's this extraordinary kind of epic, amazing ordeal. Plenty more from the weather and from disease and sickness. I can't remember exactly how many, but there were a number who die on the way over. The more surprising thing is how many survive. Other misfortunes befall this extraordinary little colony, but it kind of grittily hangs on and becomes something new in the world. And I think I'm just going to, rather annoyingly, without any grand sense of, well, what does it all mean, stop, because I've gone on long enough. I'm very happy to hear questions. Yes?
I'm assuming that, information for the book wasn't easy to come across, so where did you start with the research?
Actually, I have to be, I'm not the first person by any means to have written this story. I really kind of sewn it together, partly because I did do archival research in the Public Record Office in London, and the New York Historical Society has a manuscript copy of John Clarkson's journal, which was in 3 volumes, so sort of 2 from Nova Scotia and 1 from his year in Africa. But there have been extremely good books, actually, written about this, but of pieces. Books on what happened in the American South, and books just what happened in Sierra Leone. And I wanted to do the whole arc of the thing together. But I do what any kind of meat and potatoes historian does. You go gratefully to, I ran over, I stumbled over the story of that New York Summit Conference in the great history of New York called Gotham. And I was so startled by the story, I then went to other books, and then the books lead you to primary sources, and then you do your own archival digging and truffle hunting with your nose to the ground. So the material's been there for a while, and so the story's been around for a while. I absolutely take no credit for particular originality in this respect. This is a sort of synthesis, in a way, of stories that have been told, but sometimes you just need to attempt to do, not the complete story, no story is ever complete, but a story which can, what's not happened is that this story hasn't been lodged in the mainstream of what we tell ourselves about the American Revolution. You won't find a whole lot about this story in David McCullough or in some of the other stories. And there are books about blacks in the American Revolution, both sides. There were black patriot soldiers, of course. So, there's still stuff to be discovered. I've only just barely begun to read it, but there's a review of another book along with my book in the New Yorker by Jill Lepore, who points to a book written by a woman called Cassandra Pybus, I didn't know about, that looks as though it's covered a lot more primary sources than I did, and followed some of these people to Australia and But it's just time this story came home to American history. Yeah.
I'm Canada, and in our
Which
history,
part?
Toronto.
Oh, yeah.
And in our history, we never heard any of this, although we did hear.
Oh, there are some really good books written by academics. Is that right? I'm very surprised. Ever been to Preston, Nova Scotia?
I've been to Nova Scotia, but not Preston.
Yeah, Preston's still a black township. That was one of the great, there was a place called Birchtown near Shelburne. There was a very good black loyalist website. There was a little museum just outside Halifax. Although, typically, I rented a car to take myself to Preston, and the guy in Halifax said, oh yeah, Preston, good boxers come from Preston. It was just like an excruciating cliche, But no, there's a man called James Walker who wrote, and Robin Winks wrote a big book called Blacks in Canada. Because in the War of 1812, I should say, it happens all over again. The British again offer, and there's another huge, it's so deeply lodged in the memory of the slave world in the South that the moment actually there was a possibility of British occupation in the War of 1812, there's another huge exodus to the British and another arrival in Nova Scotia, actually. And the most of the black population in Preston, Nova Scotia, are descendants of African Americans from the War of 1812. See, I confess there was this moment where, when I heard about the Freedom Tower, and that it had to be 1,776 feet high, what's the message? That, freedom arrives in the modern world when the Brits depart? Well, yeah, I suppose so. But, in a way, it sure does. But, have we heard of Oliver Cromwell or Magna Carta or something? Is modern freedom only and forever to be defined as the 1776 moment? Well, ask Henry Washington, ask Ralph Henry, ask British freedom. They bloody well didn't think so. If it chastens us a little bit about having reinvented the world anew in 1776, ain't no bad thing, as the song says. Yeah. I believe that's the case. Oh, absolutely. Yes. If you just, how could I possibly say it? I was about to say, if you Google, and then that's how. If you were, do you really? How embarrassing is that? John Clarkson or John Clarkson's narrative, or John Clarkson's mission to America, or John Clarkson's mission to Africa. You'll get a link to the Black Loyalist website, and that will give you the whole thing online. I'm pretty sure it's the whole thing. I read it in manuscript, because I just love the kind of touchy-feely quality of that. But actually, it is lovely to read in the Historical Society.
And in another example, like Samuel Patty's diaries were all available in online as well.
I didn't hear the other example.
Diaries were all published.
Oh, yeah.
As well.
Right.
Do you find that there's more sort of significant primary sources being published online and not in print, or is that trend?
I think it's becoming so. Yeah.
Do you think that's
The whole. Do I think it's what?
a valuable thing?
Fantastic. Yeah. Absolutely. Oh God, yes. No, I have a whole other talk about the digitization of the archive, which is just going to. It's already kind of transforming what history is, especially when it happens through institutions like Library of Congress and the British Library. We now at last have the possibility of a democracy of research. You don't have to be enrolled in a PhD program. I love the fact that when I was, I can't remember, I was, God, I did, I guess I was doing some research actually about Washington's early career, not for this book, and then of course I was teaching at Columbia. And there's a thing called, it probably still is called as American Memory, which is run by the Library of Congress. And if you enter that site, you can sort of almost instantaneously get some of Washington's early annotated journals from even before his land survey days, before the French Indian Wars. But you can read it either in the digitized version of the manuscript, or you can read it in the type version, or you can read an edited version. You have this fantastic kind of array of possibilities of how to treat the archive. There's a wonderful site called Valley of the Shadow, which I really recommend, developed out of the University of Virginia, about 2 counties on either side of the Civil War, one in, I believe, in Pennsylvania and one in Maryland, I think that was right. You enter a site which is designed like Monticello, and you can head off to musical sources or diary sources or early photographs. You can treat the archive now with the enthusiasm but the not very trained expertise of a 9th grader, or someone who's in effect wants to come back to university after having finished a career, or as a serious graduate student, right, in the thick of studies. I mean, this is just the most fantastic liberation of the archive. The danger about it is it's very promiscuous, you know, isn't it? I mean, it's just that and we've already had instances of dodgy documents somehow being inserted or being insufficiently scrutinized, actually, and making it into on-site archives when they're very small archives. So, you know, there's still a role for kind of monitors at the gate, in effect, actually, to sort of making sure about the kind of authenticity of documentation.
We'll be signing those copies as well.
Do you guys ever buy books? I mean, from